the diagram is not as hard as it may look. First, just trust your eyes and describe what you see. Second, you don't need specialized knowledge to see where, what, and how the process operates. To cut a long story short, no matter how complex a diagram may look, there's always something you can understand.
Many students are afraid of diagrams. Why do you think they're so afraid?
Well, I think that diagrams are one of the more open topics. If you're describing data, for example, in a task 1 data question where you have a pie chart or a table, the language is quite limited for that. But if you have an illustration that you've never seen before, then it could be more difficult to describe. Some of the typical illustrations that people will see would be, for example, an illustration of a process where they have to describe a natural process like how a volcano erupts, or they might get a map and they'll have to talk about changes, like talk about Hanoi, or look at 2 maps, one of Hanoi in 1990 and one of Hanoi in 2025, and you have to talk about the changes that have happened to the east, the west, north, south, and so on, and find a logical way of discussing it. So I think in terms of the vocabulary, there's a lot more vocabulary that you might need to use, and perhaps it is a greater test of the candidate's ability.
And do you think, in terms of describing the diagram for the IELTS exam, how much is it about criticizing the diagram?
Well, you've got to write a minimum of 150 words. None of them will be criticism. You're not going to say, this was a terrible picture. I hated it, but if I have to describe it, no. You don't need to comment on your personal feelings, but the whole purpose of a task 1 writing is to summarize the information. So if there's a lot of information, you need to think of a way of describing all of it clearly and concisely.
Wow.
And that's the biggest challenge. So what I recommend is finding a way to divide the diagram or illustration into 2 separate parts and actually physically draw a line across the diagram, and that forms your body paragraphs. The second thing I do is then actually number the sentences that I'm going to write. And I usually recommend that they do them in a very logical way, going from left to right or right to left, and following the same pattern for both paragraphs. So if you've got a map, for example, you might have a huge amount of information to describe. So you have to choose the sentences, and you have to choose which data sets you're going to connect together. You can't describe every miniature detail. You have to link portions of data together.
Okay, so thank you so much for coming, Oliver. I think just to end off the session today, if there's one vocabulary or one idiom that you think people should know when it comes to talking about obstacles, talking about overcoming challenges, what will that be?
Apart from try, and try again. That's too boring idiom. One of the interesting ones, I can't remember the name of the king, but there was a saying, for the sake of a nail, the horse was lost. For the sake of the horse, the battle was lost. For the sake of the battle, the war was lost. And that is really talking about the looking at everything you're doing, and even the tiny details of what you're doing, and being prepared for things happening in the future. Even if the things that you're doing, they don't happen the way you expect, but you've got to be the sort of person who's prepared for those challenges in life.
Love that. Very lyrical. Love it. Thanks a lot, Oliver.
Thank you.